I'm here today with John, who is a spokesman from GE-free New Zealand and a consumer researcher and advocate. Welcome, John.
Hello.
Fantastic to have you here today. We're talking about a big topic that's happening at the moment that a lot of people might not be aware of. It is the proposed changes to the regulations on GE in New Zealand. So I guess the basics first. Can you explain to us what is GE?
Well, so what is GE? Well, GE is short for genetic engineering, but it could also be short for gene editing, because there's a spectrum of technologies that have been developed over the last 15, 20 years. And the most recent versions have been referred to as gene editing or new breeding techniques or precision breeding techniques. They're all basically referring to a very powerful technology that allows scientists to go in and change the genome of an organism, whether it's a plant or an animal. And the fact that we've got this skill and this technology and this power brings also a lot of responsibilities to find a middle path to manage it. It's a bit like any technology, whether it's nanotechnology or genetic engineering or rocket science. There's good and there's bad in all of these things. And without regulations, you can end up with a lot of bad things happening. And because genetic engineering is so powerful, the argument has always been that you've got to regulate it. Now, what's happening in New Zealand is the government has announced a kind of deregulation of genetic engineering, specifically around gene editing. And they're saying that we know so much more about it today than we used to, that they can relax the rules. And that's the kind of big debate, because how much can we relax the rules? One of the things that's characterized New Zealand is that we've actually had quite strict regulations of genetic engineering. So you can do things in the lab, you can do research. There have been field trials in New Zealand, but in terms of our production of crops, fruit, vegetables, all of that is GE-free. And that's an asset, because there's a big market internationally for non-GMO food. And at the moment, we have that benefit of being able to meet that market demand. What the government is saying is that biotechnology and genetic engineering could also make us rich. So the debate is, well, how do we find that middle path? And the concern is that the government is pushing us off that middle path to kind of putting us at the, what might be called the bleeding edge of biotechnology, having been quite conservative about it until now.
So you answered my next question, which was going to be, what is our current policy? So there is regulation obviously in place at the moment, but moving forward, this might mean that takes away that regulation. So that's not necessarily a good thing for us, is it?
Well, the argument is it a good thing or not? And as I say, we're looking for a middle path. Biotechnology and genetic engineering is already used. For example, for years, insulin has been made in the lab for diabetics to use using a gene editing process. Now, that's in containment. And a lot of things and a lot of arguments in support of genetic engineering are from the medical uses, which are very different from the environmental use of a gene-edited product. So you can contain it, you can regulate it. Once it's in the environment, it's far more difficult to contain or regulate a genetically engineered organism. So liability, containment, making sure that nature itself isn't impacted by the new organism entering the environment. Those are fundamentals that our legislation till now has actually ensured. So there is a precautionary approach. If you don't know quite what you're doing, you make sure that you don't do it and cause unexpected harm. There's lots of regional councils like Hawke's Bay. They've also got extra rules at the local level, and they've created like GE-free zones where the growers can be guaranteed to be protected from GE field trials. Now again, the new legislation that's being developed will take away the right of regions like Northland and Hawke's Bay to be GE-free zones and market themselves in that way. So that's a fundamental loss to those regions. But the bigger issue is that the government's planning to relax the wider suite of legislation to enable and allow more genetic engineering in the environment. And that's where the issues really arise.
So there's the issue of gene modification potentially helping to reduce emissions. Does that not make it a good thing?
Well, there's lots of good things you could potentially do with genetic engineering and gene editing. The reality is that what does that do in the actual world? We've got options to address climate change now. I mean, the organics industry, agroecology. So about 10 or 15 years ago, Dairy NZ did research showing mixed forage can actually reduce methane and maintain production. Now that was as a non-patentable action. So you can't patent mixed forage. You can patent GE ryegrass to do the same thing. So there's an opportunity cost that we're facing, which is to say, do we push the GE solutions or these like nature-based solutions, reducing the stock levels, managing the feed in a different way? So the argument is that we've actually got solutions to climate change that we should be using, and we're not. And we're being asked to kind of wait till this new technology comes along, which can be patented and, you know, clip the ticket to save the planet, rather than open source actions that we can do now.
So, John, are there safeguards that can be put in place to ensure that the environmental and the economic benefits outweigh the possible downsides?
Well, absolutely, there are. And in a way, that's what we've had. We've had very strict regulations so that, for example, even in the regions which have tried to create GE-free zones, they haven't, in some cases, had an outright ban on GE. They've said if you're going to do a trial, you've got to be liable if that trial goes out of hand and contaminates the environment outside of it. If you're going to do a trial, you've got to have a bond to clean up the trial if things go wrong or at the end of that trial. And these are real examples. I mean, if you look online, you can Google an experiment that was done by Ag Research over 10 years ago now. And if you have to Google mutant cows die in GE trial, I think that's the headline. And it was one of the examples of these trials we've had in New Zealand, which have actually been fairly contained. There have been a few breaches, kind of like a bit of a heads up to our scientists to saying, you thought you were going to keep this contained, and actually the mesh in the lab allowed these seeds to escape. These things had actually happened. So I think the scientists and the scientific community are a bit more aware of the fact that regulation and containment and control isn't as easy as it might have been believed to have been in the past, because things have gone wrong. But the regulations we've got, I would argue, have served us well. The government's talking about doubling exports in 10 years. And, you know, and Christopher Luxon has said to me personally, you know, biotechnology and GE will make us rich. Now, used in containment, used ethically to develop new medicines and new products, he may be right. But the risk is that to try and get rich out of biotechnology, we mustn't sacrifice what is kind of almost now making us rich today, which is our reputation, our image as clean, green, non-GMO, organic. Those are really appealing to consumers globally, and that's what we've been marketing ourselves as. And if we lose that, we're really in trouble. So the battle here now is to say to the government, well, whatever you're planning to do to kind of get rich from biotechnology, you can't also put at risk what makes us rich today, which is our reputation and our clean, safe food that can be traced from the fork, you know, from the farm to the fork, where people know what they're eating, farmers know what they're growing. That is what's at risk today.
So could you outline the key concerns with these proposed changes?
Well, the proposed changes haven't been published yet. But that's the concern, because what we've been told by visiting bureaucrats in Wellington is that not only is this bill being written to do a number of things, specifically to exclude the precautionary principle, so that the ministers directed officials to not include precaution in the bill. Now, precaution is one of those kind of global themes that says if you don't know what you're doing, you've got to be cautious. So we need that. And the fact that the government's removed that from the upcoming bill is a major concern. Another thing that they've already signalled is that there's not going to be any ethical kind of criteria within this bill. The minister argues that other legislation will cover animal welfare. But my concern is that, well, it hasn't worked so far as other legislations to protect animals, so why would it continue to work into the future? We do need some ethical criteria in the bill. As I mentioned, the animal welfare issues of those trials in the past show that the regulations we've got for animal welfare, especially when it comes to genetic engineering, where you could actually engineer an animal to have features that suit industrial farming, but may not be good for the animal, those sort of things really need to be, to be guarded against. Another thing that doesn't seem to be part of the bill is liability for users of GE if something goes wrong. So if they contaminate a conventional crop and that farmer can't then sell it to the non-GMO market, who kind of pays for that? And the signals from government are that, well, actually, go to court and work it out yourselves. We do need some kind of system to motivate compliance to containment. If you know you can get away with an accident and your crop spreads into another field and there's no onus on you to compensate, then the motivation to maintain those standards isn't really there. And there's a huge appetite in the biotechnology industry for risk. And that risk today is what's called socialized risk. So the public pay if something goes wrong. If it's going to be patented, if a product is basically designed to make money, it may be designed to do other things as well, like climate change, mitigation or whatever. But if it's going to be driven by patenting, you've got to have that kind of corollary, which is to say, well, you've also got to take some of the responsibility. So that's a key part of the bill that's missing. So we haven't seen the final bill, but one of the most concerning things that came out of discussions in Wellington over the last few weeks was that if you don't speak up now, the select committee process may not make any changes to this bill. So we're really concerned that once the bill comes out, the voices of farmers, of exporters, of consumers will kind of be ignored. So we're really calling on people now to contact essentially the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister as the leaders of government to call in the Minister and the people writing this bill to make sure these precautions and these protections for nature and the public and the right to choose are in place in the bill. Without those, we're in real trouble.
So as it stands now, John, do you believe that there's enough consultation with the consumer and the wider market of New Zealand to have their say in how they feel about this?
Well, that's a great question, because this debate in New Zealand has been a little bit under the radar for quite a few years. We have no GMO crops being grown in New Zealand. So when you go to the supermarket, you can look at the fresh fruit and vegetables and not have to worry about making that choice and understanding what you're buying. Same for growers. I mean, basically, farmers know what they're planting and will continue to do so if we keep our regulations in place. What's being proposed is that a whole set of these new genomic techniques, these gene-edited products, will be exempted from regulation. And what that means is that not only there'll be no external oversight of whether these really are what they think they are, that the genomic changes have been made are just those, because the whole process of gene editing and genetic engineering can make other incidental changes that need to be checked. So that needs to be done, and if they're exempted, that won't be happening. Companies will be left to do it themselves, and we know when companies self-regulate, things can go wrong. Farmers today know what they're planting. If you make small gene-edited product changes to a genome of a plant or an animal, and don't label it, don't tell people that this change has been made, then over time you won't know what that genome consists of. So labelling to allow consumer choice, and that's what's happened in New Zealand. There's very little GMO product being even imported onto our supermarket shelves. A lot goes into animal feed, which is invisible to the consumer. But what happened in New Zealand over the last 15 or 20 years is the consumer has kind of spoken, and the market in New Zealand is non-GMO. I mean, one of the things that the Minister, Judith Collins, talks about is, New Zealanders don't care about GE. They're drinking GE soy milk in their cafe lattes of a morning. Well, actually, all the supermarket brands of soy milk are non-GMO. And I've got one here. I did a talk a few months ago, and I actually went to all the supermarket shelves and looked at what was on sale in New Zealand. And this is only one of them. It's about 10 actually. But this is an organic one, so automatically non-GMO, because organics doesn't allow GMO. But if you go to the supermarket today and look at any of the soy milks, you'll see non-GMO on all of them. So when Minister Collins says, people don't care, well, number one, the market has spoken. There is non-GMO and organic as the mainstay. And of course, soy is the main product from America. There's a few others, but soy is the main one. The first one that was globally exported from America to be mixed up. So GE and non-GE was mixed up, and there wasn't going to be a choice. And the market pushed back. So globally, companies like Sanitarium, for example, they call identity preserved soy. So they trace the soy from where they buy it and where it's grown all the way through to the product. So as I say, the market in New Zealand is non-GMO. It's kind of invisible because there is no GMO stuff being grown here. That could change, and again, that's a whole new can of worms. Because if people don't have a choice, then we've got market failure. There's a large support, majority support for non-GMO food and for gene-edited food to be labelled. What's happening, and it's not just this new legislation that's coming through now, but legislation that's already being processed through FSANZ. This is the Food Standards Australia New Zealand, and they set the standards for GMO food being sold in supermarkets, for example. They've already announced that they're not going to regulate these gene-edited products. So without that regulation, no testing, no tracing, no labelling, no choice. So again, a very big issue because consumers want choice. And internationally, as I say, we've not had the big debate here for quite a few years because we haven't had GE here. In America, huge growth in what's called the non-GMO project market. In fact, some of our exporters, Fonterra, use the non-GMO logo to sell our products in America. So does our Lewis Road Creamery. So there's a market asset, an export asset to say we're non-GMO, especially to America, to Japan, to India. The market for non-GMO food is growing double digits every year globally, projected for the next 10 years. So there's a benefit to New Zealand from meeting that market demand. And one of the questions has been, what has been the consultation to date with the public and with farmers? And the answer is very little. Over the years, there's been engagement. The Royal Society did a very good study, talking to consumers, talking to other interest groups over a year ago now. And their main conclusion is there needs to be more debate, there needs to be more discussion before we change the rules. Now, that hasn't happened. And as I say, the big concern is that the select committee that the bill will go to isn't the venue for those discussions. Anything that's not in the bill will be deemed out of scope. So if you say, well, hang on, liability isn't in this bill, so people using GE crops might contaminate a conventional crop, so who's going to sort that out? The answer from the select committee will be, well, it's not in the bill, so we can't discuss it. So they're really creating walls for people to contribute to this discussion rather than enabling the discussion.
So as it stands now, John, which you have touched on, I can go into the supermarket and feel confident that there is no GM products in front of me and I can make that decision feeling good that there's no GM. Can we really talk about why we should care about this? Because I think almost we're taking it for granted that that's the current situation and what the potential future might look like if this goes through.
Well, I worked in marketing for many years and it's all about consumer choice and the right to choose and what consumers want. And there are some consumers who kind of like the idea of genetic engineering and they think, well, yeah, it might be a good thing. But the majority of people say, well, probably not. And I can tell you, the vast majority in America, in Europe, surveys show that it's about 85% of the public. So it's not just like, the anti-GE brigade. But 85% of the public say, yes, gene-edited products need to be regulated, they need to be traced, and they need to be labelled so people have a choice. So that choice is about to be taken away. So not only are rules about labelling changing so that the most new gene-edited products will not be traced, will not be labelled to allow people a choice, but growers and farmers won't know what they're planting unless it's traced and tracked. Now, today, that's the situation. There's an integrity in our system. Without that being maintained, we are on a slippery slope to not knowing what farmers are growing, not knowing what we're exporting to the world. So without labelling and traceability, we've created a major problem for New Zealand exporters. And again, the signals are, both from the Food Standards Authority and also this new upcoming bill, is that for these new gene-edited products, there won't be any traceability. Total disaster. Traceability is absolutely key to the integrity of our export reputation. And it's also key to allowing consumers to choose. As I say, the market in New Zealand has spoken. When people are given a choice, they prefer not to buy GMO, and hence there's not a lot of GMO on our shelves. So it's not just farmers and consumers, but taking that economic lens, it's exporters. So we've got a fantastic export market. As I say, Fonterra using the non-GMO project to market milk and dairy products into America, because the Americans didn't have that right to choose. Just to be clear, the reason why the non-GMO project exists in America is there was no labeling. So companies said, well, we're going to secure our supply chain to be non-GMO, and we're going to label it so people have a choice. And that's been huge in America, and we're benefiting it from that as exporters. And the same in Europe. The demand for non-GMO and organics is huge.
It's interesting that we haven't looked at that though, isn't it? You know, and seen that as the market trend.
Well, I think if you talk to some of the companies, they'll say, oh yeah, we're seeing it. I spoke to the head of Lewis Road Creamery then a few years ago, and he said the minute he landed in America and started talking to people about, you know, shipping Lewis Road Creamery and dairy products from New Zealand to America, they'd ask him, is it non-GMO? And he could say yes. And hence they use that non-GMO project on some of their products. The asset for our exporters is clear in those conversations with the receiving markets and with consumers. But if you don't look or don't want to listen, you won't hear. And so it's a real concern. What the government seems to be saying here is that they're not going to do an economic analysis of this deregulation of GE either. And I'd say that's a major Achilles heel in the process, apart from not allowing the voices of consumers and farmers and growers to be heard now while the bill's being developed. Exporters are being put in the firing line if they cannot maintain traceability and labelling. And without, you know, regulation of gene editing, which is what's being proposed, large proportions of the new gene-edited products will not be regulated under the proposed legislation. We're entering a disaster zone, and it must be stopped. We've got to have labelling and traceability to allow choice and to allow the integrity of our food supply to continue. For things that are grown in New Zealand or being exported from New Zealand, the organic industry, like cereals, have really spoken up because they haven't been consulted in this bill. And to be honest, they're absolutely in the firing line. The choice of organic and non-GMO food is in the firing line if you don't regulate and contain and trace these new gene-edited products. In a way, it will boil down to, I want to trust that brand because I know they're doing everything they can to keep GE out and be organic or be non-GMO conventional. That is about to become very expensive if this legislation comes through. If you have to secure your supply chain against contamination that's widespread, it's a very different scenario from today where it's not widespread, where you can be confident, apart from soy, actually, you can be pretty confident that you've got a secure supply of most ingredients. As that changes over time, the European supermarkets and food manufacturers have written to officials there because the same debate's going on in Europe about deregulating gene editing. And they've said the cost of food in supermarkets will go up if you do not regulate, if you do not trace and allow a system that maintains integrity. It will be every man for himself, and cereals will be saying, well, how do I know this is what you're saying it is?
So we've touched on the environmental and the economical potential slippery slope, as you call it, that we might go down if this bill goes through. Can you bring it right back to our internal environment, and can we look at perhaps the potential implications of GE crops, ingesting them, and what they might mean for us in our personal every day-to-day lives?
Well, it's a very difficult question to answer because there's actually been no long-term studies on the impact of genetic engineered food on people's health. So you're looking at kind of anecdotal and like intuitive kind of understanding. In America, the metabolic health of the public is extremely bad, and they've got a lot of GMOs in their food system. The only real tangible example where we do know things can go wrong and in terms of the impact on the human body is things like GM soy that's been designed to be sprayed with Roundup. So one of the main things that have been done with genetic engineering is crops that can be sprayed with glyphosate and survive it, and then they absorb it. So when they introduced GM soy in America, they also changed the allowance of residues of glyphosate in food by 200 times. So people's guts are now being exposed to glyphosate because the crops have got more glyphosate in them. And we know that glyphosate is, for example, an antibiotic, which will harm the natural gut biome. So people have been very concerned to avoid GM soy in America. And in fact, I think the Association of Pediatricians recently did a report in America saying this is how to avoid GMO soy because it will have more Roundup. Now, that's actually the Roundup in it, not the GM bit that's caused that issue. But any genetic engineering change can cause other metabolites, maybe a new allergen to emerge. There was an example of this about 15 years ago with a product called Starlink corn. And Starlink corn was engineered to be used as animal feed, but unfortunately it got mixed in with human food. And they had to do a global recall of Starlink corn. It cost $1 billion to recall it. And it's because it had a suspected allergen in it that they didn't want it to enter the food supply. Now, whether that would have been a major allergen for many people, maybe only a couple of people would have been allergic to it. Either way, not a good thing. And even the most recent experiments with the GE ryegrass being developed by Ag Research and others, the one that you hear about, we haven't been able to do it here, you've had to go over to America to do these trials. Well, let's just be really clear about those trials. They've been going on for like a couple of decades. Not one animal has actually been fed this crop to see what the impacts are on the gut, on that animal health, let alone people. There's alternatives, it already exists. Germinal seeds have got a non-GE ryegrass that reduces methane and does the very things that the one that's being developed is being designed to do. So we can already do it, but that's not patented, and the new GE ryegrass will be. But that, for example, if a GE ryegrass was developed to be Roundup ready, farmers might want to spray it with Roundup. Again, that's going to increase the chemicals going into our food. So taking it back, we know more and more gut health, natural food, fibre, all of these things are much more integral to human health than we used to think. And genetic engineering, as I say, with these unexpected changes, possible allergens, these things need to be regulated. And if they're not regulated, these things will arise as problems.
At Ceres Organics, that very much the motto is eating for change and working with the rhythms of nature and what that means for the plant and the seed and the weather and the seasons and where it's come from, all those intricate facets of having an end product that's certified organic. How does GM disrupt that whole process in harmony with nature? Does it even work in harmony with nature?
The macro trends in terms of things like agroecology is learning to work with nature and the rhythms of nature and the systems of nature rather than kind of like overriding them. And genetic engineering, some people call it colonization of nature. There's definitely examples of biopiracy where traditional seeds have been taken by companies and then patented with a GE version to piggyback on existing things like resistance to drought. So nature and the complexity of nature has always been that interface where farming and nature happens. With genetic engineering, some people have called it a potential living pollution because any organism that isn't contained can spread into nature. And as I say, bacteria and fungi and microbes are particularly impossible to regulate and contain. So once they enter the natural systems, you're kind of accelerating evolution in the open environment. So the natural environment is absolutely at threat from new organisms being brought in. And they might not just be genetically engineered. There's new technology called synthetic biology where you can literally create a new organism. Now, if that's put into nature, again, it's really impacting natural ecosystems and evolution. So the precaution that we need in terms of interacting with nature, with new organisms, has to be high. And globally, that's been recognised. So there's a global agreement called the CBD, the Convention on Biodiversity, where precaution is actually a fundamental element of the global agreement. For our government to take precaution away is really putting not just economics and exporters and farmer choice and consumer choice on the line. It's putting nature on the line. So again, the need for regulation, the need for understanding of what we might be doing in nature. And it's a one-way street. So if you're going to do it and you can't take it back, you've got to be really cognizant of what you're doing. That's not what's happening. It has been what's happening. That's what our legislation does today. It requires an applicant. There's no ban on GMOs in New Zealand. You have to apply with evidence of safety to people and the environment. And the industry is saying, well, that's quite hard. So can't we make it easier? And the solution has been, well, we'll make it so much easier that we're not even going to regulate these products. And that's really not on.
So if somebody was sitting on the fence, John, as to whether GE yes, GE no, GE maybe, is there a body of evidence that perhaps the government or a government body has undertaken that we can find, that we can look at ourselves, to look at both sides, to see the evidence or potential evidence of how this could be a good thing?
Absence of evidence and evidence of absence is one of the little catchphrases. So absence of evidence means that there's no evidence that this might cause harm, there's no evidence of this, no evidence of that. But that's not to say that if you didn't look more carefully, you wouldn't find evidence of harm. Now, so data and information, both economic but also scientific, is basically what we have to rely on. And that's the big issue today. It seems that the government hasn't done an economic analysis of the benefits of non-GMO and organic production and exports versus what might happen if it's contaminated or undermined by GE being deregulated. So that seems to be a fundamental missing piece of the debate that anybody in New Zealand would want to have. So what's the economic aspects as well? But it is bigger than that. It's not just an economic information that's missing. The scientific information about what happens in nature to complex systems is also missing. Now, the argument is, well, if you can't do the trials, then you're not going to have the data. As I say, the trials have been done in New Zealand and they haven't been successful, both plants and animals. But internationally, we've seen contamination of fields from crops that have been grown. We've seen honey in America cannot be produced as a non-GMO product because pollen has been collected and spread around. It has to be very isolated and it cannot now be guaranteed. In New Zealand, we can guarantee our honey to be non-GMO. So the economic calculations need to be done and they don't seem to have been done, which I would say is kind of like tantamount to, basically playing Russian roulette with our economy. Without that data to say this is the benefit of non-GMO and organic production today, and this is what we need to protect to become rich from the biotech angle as well, we've got to find that middle path. And as I say, I think New Zealand has actually had that middle path. We have got allowance for GMOs in New Zealand. There is trials, there are research in medicine. Yes, there could be more, and I don't think anyone's argued against reviewing the regulations for contained applications in medicine, which has already happened. But this is a new bill. This is about the environment. This is about nature, and this is about our farming exports. And once you're at that macro level where our economy is very reliant on exports, I think it's more than just being remiss to not have that data. So again, one of the calls on the government today, and as I say, I'm hoping the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister will intervene on this bill before it comes out to say, look, there's a whole lot of things missing in this bill, including the analysis of the economic issues that might result from any deregulation. Yes, there'll be money in deregulation for the GE and biotech industry, but at what cost? Is it the cost to nature, the cost to the consumer losing the right to choose, the cost of loss of the integrity of our traceability and food production system, so we can't even guarantee what we're exporting? These are fundamental issues that are not being addressed now, and they need to be.
So if we don't go forward with this, won't we miss out?
Well, that's a great question, because in America, which is one of the most deregulated markets, there's not been a lot of successful gene-edited products launched to market. I mean, one of them was a non-browning mushroom that never seemed to have got into the market at all. You've also got these other things like, lab-grown meat and lab-grown milks, etc., being produced with very advanced technology. Some of those lab-grown meat, for example, have been pulled off the market. There was one that was being sold in very flash restaurants in New York, Gonski, not successful. I mean, even the Impossible Burger, which has used a mixture of GM heme to make it bloody, but also GE soy as the main ingredient. When they came into the New Zealand market, they stopped using the GE soy. They used conventional soy because they know the market, as I mentioned earlier, the market in New Zealand is non-GMO. That's what the consumers are expecting. One of the things that's happened in Europe, actually, is to say, well, if these gene-edited products are so like nature, which is what's being claimed, so much nature they don't need to be regulated, which I would argue is untrue. They may be like nature, but they need to be regulated. The argument is that, well, maybe you shouldn't be allowed to patent them. And so that might be a very interesting, there's two things that can moderate risk-taking. One is, well, you're not going to be able to patent this and clip the ticket. So, then the playing field against alternative nature-based solutions becomes a bit more even. But also, if you're going to clip the ticket, you need to be liable. If you need to have responsibility for your product. So all of those new challenges and new problems that genetic engineering and gene editing bring, we haven't got that with existing plants and animals. And therefore, kind of again, we're almost adding problems to the list of problems people have to navigate. And what we need is a middle path, and regulation is key to that. And an agenda to deregulate, to open up New Zealand's market, to actually leapfrog from being one of the most cautious in the world to the least cautious in the world, which seems to be what's being pushed. Totally the wrong thing for New Zealand to be doing.
All right, John. Well, hopefully people are much more informed on this bill going forward, and the next step is what can we do? Because I think there's an urgency here. We've got, 2 to 3 weeks to get our voices heard. Where can somebody go to find out more information should they need it? And then how can they take a step towards stopping this bill going through?
Well, the organisation I'm spokesperson for is called GE-free New Zealand, and we've got a website with lots of up-to-date information and press releases covering the debate over many years. So that's a really good resource, ge-free.org.nz. More recently, Organics Aotearoa New Zealand have been really engaging with bureaucrats and MPs and ministers down in Wellington. And their report, which is on the OANZ website, is really important. It's the most up-to-date feedback we're getting from government to say what's going to be in this bill. For me, we need to speak up now before the bill comes out. And the only people I believe who've got the mana and the responsibility to change is the Prime Minister. Now Christopher Luxon, a leader in Air New Zealand for many years, he knows what branding's about. And Brand New Zealand, not to mention our exports, our consumer rights to choose, are all on the firing line. So he should speak up. I also think that Winston Peters, as a leader of New Zealand First, his support base has also got a lot of awareness about issues like this. He should be speaking up. And both of them, as I say, have got the mana, the responsibility and the seniority in government to say, excuse me, but this bill here, without precaution, without liability, without ethics to protect animals, without an economic analysis of what the risks and benefits to New Zealand are going to be, without those things, that cannot stand. It's for them, it's for Chris and for Winston to speak up and defend Brand New Zealand. And the only way they're going to be encouraged to do that is if they hear from members of the public, if they hear from ordinary New Zealanders say, I heard this is going down, no thanks.
So what is the actual cut-off date?
Basically, the day the bill comes out, into select committee. Let's be clear, just because the bureaucrats say, oh, the select committee ain't going to change anything, it's another bite at this cherry. If they don't change the bill before it comes out, and it is as bad as it looks like it's going to be, then we've got to push harder. If we do not stop a bill that removes precaution and removes protection for non-GMO and organic producers in New Zealand, if we don't stop that, then we're in a really bad position globally. We'll be put not at the cutting edge of biotechnology, we'll be at the bleeding edge of biotechnology. And that's, as I say, with nanotechnology and synthetic biology, all part of this game, we're really opening up a Pandora's box, which will undermine our natural systems and our economy.
And it's as soon as next year, 2025, that it would all start kicking into gear, isn't it?
Well, they're definitely rushing this, and there has been no proper public consultation. I mean, the argument being that will happen at Select Committee, but we've already been told, and that's a bit of a no-hoper. So that lack of public engagement with Māori, with growers, with farmers, and with consumers, there has been studies, and the studies are really clear. People want it labelled. They want a choice. They don't want to be forced to have it. They don't want it to be hidden in the food system. Those are fundamentals to marketing, to branding. So if we lose those, which looks like may happen under this bill, if we lose those protections and fundamentals, as I say, we're kind of entering a very dangerous zone for both the environment, for people's health, for our exports, and brand New Zealand.
So talking about the main supplier to the consumer, has there been any consultation with the supermarket brands throughout New Zealand?
Well, as far as I'm aware, no. I mean, obviously submarkets are able to make submissions, and they will have been involved with the food standards discussion about deregulating gene editing earlier this year. But a couple of things about supermarkets, and good on them. Pam's the biggest single brand in New Zealand, and Woolworths now, with their macro and other own labels. Both of those companies have a non-GMO policy for their own label products. So that's going to become more expensive and more difficult to preserve if these deregulatory processes go through. So, and as I said, in Europe, the supermarkets have warned, unless you regulate it and allow a system to maintain integrity, food in supermarkets will go up as well, ordinary food. So we're on a very slippery slope. And in a way, I hope that Woolworths as a major provider to New Zealand consumers will both maintain their non-GMO policy for all their own label products, but also push back and say to the government, whether it's select committee or now, this is not a good thing to be doing without those regulatory precautions and without traceability. So no one's saying that there are no good things in genetic engineering. In fact, as I say, that medical uses, contained uses, it's not against the science, it's against the use of powerful technology in the environment. And that's a different scenario from what you might do in a lab, for sick people or for medicine. It's a very different discussion. So when you hear people conflate them, say, we must have GE because of the sick people, different conversation. We're talking about the environment and nature. And nature's very complex. And yes, the technology is very clever, but the interaction between nature and clever technology needs to be regulated and guided independently by government, not by the companies themselves, who may not have much of an interest to maintain the integrity of nature and want to get a product out to market. There is an old saying, we've been genetically engineering or genetically modifying food for thousands of years. And that's, again, a little bit misleading. We've been selective breeding for thousands of years, hence the diversity we've got today. Genetic engineering is another level again. It's much more powerful. Gene editing is more targeted. So the old GMOs, it was a little bit more random in the way they made the changes. Today, it's much easier, but there's a scale effect, and there's a very good scientific analysis of this by Professor Jack Heinemann from the University of Canterbury. And he talks about the scale effect, the fact that if you're making one small change and it's in containment in a lab, one thing. If anyone can make a gene edit, which they can now with, you can literally buy gene edited kits on the internet. So without those controls and contained uses, as that Pandora's box opens up, you've got a whole new set of problems. Yes, it's powerful. Yes, gene technology has got benefits, but we've got to find the middle path. And I'm arguing the middle path is keep nature, keep non-GMO, keep organic production and its integrity, whatever you're doing over here, in the hope it's going to make us rich or do other things.
Well, thank you so much for your time today, John. It's been incredible hearing all your knowledge and wisdom around this, truly inspiring. And for those of you watching, if you want to find out more or take next steps with action, we'll list all the websites and references down below.